All right, looking at the various theories discussed this week, what do you think is the most likely scenario for how the Americas were originally discovered and populated? Overall, it seemed like the class was fairly evenly split between the various theories that were discussed this week. The most popular, I would have to say, would probably be the land bridge hypothesis, which is I'd say a good thing. I mean, that's certainly the scenario and the theory that we have the most evidence for. We know at least some people came across the ice during the last ice age between Siberia and Alaska. There's evidence of that. Whether or not they were the very first people or not, I would say is with the timeline and where those sites are located still up in the air. But certainly no story of the peopling of the Americas can be told without having that be one of the elements. Whether the land bridge hypothesis is the only element or not is sort of up for debate, but certainly a good grounding to mention the land bridge hypothesis and the importance that plays. Also, a decent amount of people like the idea of the sea route hypothesis, that it made sense that that might be a way for people to travel faster and more efficiently and potentially reach some of these sites in South America or the southern continental United States or the east coast of the continental United States. Relatively quickly and still get them close to that time period that we think that this peopling occurred in. Of course, there's a lot of people brought up the biggest lack of evidence, or the biggest strike against this is the lack of evidence. Which true, that is certainly the strike against it, but that's not terribly unexpected, I would say, since once the sea levels did rise following the Ice Age, essentially any site that would have been along the coast or anywhere it would have been easy to bring one of these boats that could have been used is probably about 100 feet underwater at this point in time. So it's going to be very difficult to identify any of those sites. But there is a lot of circumstantial evidence that leads towards this, right? That a lot of the surrounding people, whether it was in the Japanese islands, whether it was the Solutreans in Europe, or so forth, had access to boats and knew how to sail. Whether or not they were sturdy enough or robust enough to make the trip is still up for question. But it does seem that unless you want to push the date that those people came across the Bering Strait land bridge much farther back than we think it happened, there has to be some explanation for how people were able to travel so quickly once they did reach the United States without having to huff it, from the Bering Straits down to the very southern portion of South America just in time for us to have this archaeological site. In some cases, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So it seems like there's a strong possibility that even if we don't have the direct evidence for it, that those sea routes were used. Certainly looking at the archaeological evidence does give some credence to the Solutrean idea, the fact that the stone tools used early on after the inhabitation of the Americas are similar to what was happening and being used in Europe. But that's not, I would say, the perfect answer, because this could simply be a scenario where, given similar environments, given the large land animals that were present in both Europe and the Americas, that adopting similar tools and similar technology was going to happen, whether there was direct contact or not. I saw a lot of other people bringing up the idea of the DNA for the Solutrean hypothesis, and I think I need to expand on this because I don't think I delved too deeply into it into the PowerPoint where I think some people are drawing this. The DNA evidence in total, looking at the population and the peopling of the Americas, points 100% that the American Indians came from Asia, right? That they came from Asia somehow over for the most part. The DNA part with the Solutrean is that there are some genetic markers and so forth that are more common in European populations, leading some to the theory that there might have been some small level of contact prior to the contact era, which we'll be talking about more today, that could have been in there prior to that time period. And that's where there's this idea of maybe a small population came over from Europe, the Solutreans making their way across the ice, or using boats to get across that same route. But if there was a population that moved from Europe into the United States, it would have very quickly been absorbed into a much larger population that was moving from Asia and populating the Americas. Really, I would say probably you're looking at some combination of multiple of these or maybe all of them, as it seems like just one isn't probably the silver bullet. So it's likely that it's probably some sort of combination between the various theories, and perhaps a theory that we haven't even thought of yet, and some information might still be forthcoming on that. I mean, that's really one of the exciting things about this topic is that it's sort of a mystery. We don't know 100%, and it's an exciting thing too because it's a scenario where an archaeological discovery could happen tomorrow, which could completely change our understanding. So, certainly something if you're interested in the topic to keep your eye on. Moving on here. So by the time of contact of Europeans, American Indians had spread to nearly every habitable location in the Americas. What aspects do you believe led to the success of American Indian populations in the thousands of years before contact of Europeans? I think overall, the class did a very good job picking up on the high degree of geographic specialization was a key element to the success of American Indian groups. The fact that there's so much geographic diversity in the Americas, and the fact that humans figured out how to live and survive and thrive in pretty much all of those different regions and climates is pretty incredible. And I think it gives a really clear depiction of a people who were very in tune with their natural environments because they needed to be in order to survive. I mean, if you're going to be the Inuit people surviving on the frozen coasts of North America and up in Canada, you need to have an extremely precise knowledge of how and where you can get enough food and resources to survive. And that's just one example of how people in almost any geographic region in the Americas were able to find ways to sustain themselves. Whether this was doing hunting and gathering practices, which of course the original peoples coming into the Americas opted for hunting and gathering, and in some locations hunting and gathering was going to be just what made sense. If you're talking about the Great Plains regions, primarily before the introduction of the horse after contact, really the only way to survive in that area is going to be hunting and gathering lifestyle following the bison herds across the plains. In those locations where large stratified states could be sustained based upon the development of agriculture, like in the Andes Mountain region or Central America, where you see the development of the Maya, the Toltec, eventually the Mexica or the Aztec, you do see the development of large stratified states similar to what you would see in Eurasia, with incredibly complex political systems and governmental systems and religions and pretty much everything that we think of as those large stratified states developed in the locations where it made sense to do so. And a lot of times what you see within the Americas are people pretty much using something called seasonal subsistence patterns, where depending on what time of the year it is, depending on what's growing at the time, they can sort of change between being strictly agriculturalists or hunter and gatherers or living more nomadic lifestyle and switch between them. For example, in Minnesota here, the seasonal subsistence patterns would, in the summertime where it was easy to grow food, that is essentially what the American Indians would do. They'd grow food and have set sedentary villages. In the fall, they'd break up and go into smaller groups and sort of gather the food that was there and then the animals that were around. Same way with the winter, breaking down into smaller population groups to hunt and support themselves off these animals. And in the spring, coming back together, picking the berries and the natural foliage and so forth that was coming back in the springtime, and then once more in summer getting back into much larger population groups. So being very flexible depending upon what made sense at the time. So really, when you talk about like the population size of the Americas, it's really dependent upon the resources that are available. But I think it's important to note that these were intelligent people making intelligent choices based upon their situation. For example, it wouldn't make any sense for a population set in the Great Plains region that couldn't support a large population center to have a city of 50,000 people if 90% of them are going to starve every year. It's really people making choices for what makes sense based upon the resources that are available to them. And because they were so good at making those smart choices, by the time of contact with the Europeans, you really do see a very large population within the Americas. Not as large as Eurasia, but certainly you see something at least comparable to people per square footage and so forth, even though the people are not quite as densely populated as you see in Eurasia due to there being relatively fewer large stratified states, but you do certainly still have them in the Americas as well. So what factors drove 15th century European explorers? What was the motivation for their explorations, and what made their voyages possible? To start considering this question, you really have to look at the isolation of Europe at the beginning of this time period, particularly talking about global trade is concerned. Europe coming through sort of the collapse of the Roman Empire, the rebuilding into the Middle Age time period, had for the most part been fairly isolated from the main centers of commerce in the world, which was really sort of the corridor between the Middle East, China, with India in the middle, and the steppe lands stretching between them as well, including the east coast of Africa and through land trade routes into North Africa. Those were the locations that were sort of most vibrant and connected via these trade routes. And they had a lot of really cool things, essentially, that they were trading that Europeans sort of realized that were out there, primarily after the time period of the Crusades, and getting more contact with the wider world on a limited basis. Certain locations, such as Venice, Italy, for example, were able to create pretty powerful states trading with the Muslim kingdoms and empires, the emerging Ottoman Empire, for example, and were able to become quite profitable. But there was a sense that Europe was definitely on the very last end of this much larger trading world, and that they wanted to gain better and more access to these goods because, of course, if one king or one ruler was able to get these items, for example, spices were very, very sought after, incense, porcelain china, cloth, and so forth were all very, very highly prized. Spices, particularly because they were essentially could make food taste better, they could preserve food. It was seen as a status symbol, and that if they could gain access to these goods before anyone else, they could make a huge amount of profit. Of course, Europe was not one political state at this point in time. It was essentially broken up between a lot of rival competing kingdoms. So they definitely wanted to compete with each other to gain access to these resources. If you look at the very first attempts to, for example, sail around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa by the Portuguese, the main intent was to try to tap into these trading networks. Now, there are a few things that made Europe successful during this time period that they had not been able to really push the boundaries of this exploration beforehand, and that was primarily technology that was now being made available in Europe, which had not been widely available before this time period, and that they had essentially received that technology from Muslim seafarers that, Genoa, Venice, other trading cities in Italy had been in contact and had sort of learned and traded for these various goods. So, for example, the compass is an example of technology that was developed in China, was eventually adopted by Muslim seafarers, and was then adopted by Europeans. Same thing with the astrolabe to help tell your latitude and longitude, developed by Arab seafarers, picked up by sort of the general broader Muslim world, and was then transferred to the Europeans as well. And these are really what's going to help them start navigating larger distances, as well as the invention of the caravel, the lateen sail to help tack into the wind. All these are going to make the expansion of seafaring possible. The end result of being able to tap into these trade networks, as the Portuguese are successful and able to do, is great profit. They come back, and even though they lose a number of ships in the process, the amount of trade goods that they're able to bring back with them makes them a great amount of profit, and really just going to set the stage for other explorers to try to accomplish the same thing. Now, when the Spanish eventually start funding Columbus and other expeditions into the Caribbean region, they realize fairly quickly that no, they have not actually reached Asia as Columbus was intending to do. They have instead essentially found a new location, but that there was some evidence that there could be some gold available. So, once more, profit seems to be a huge motivating factor in these explorations, as very quickly they try to start exploiting the American Indian populations of these islands and eventually the mainland to try to find and accumulate as much of this sort of hard material wealth as they can. Of course, along the coast of Africa, they begin to trade with the African kingdoms along the coast for enslaved individuals, which they realize they can start using on plantations to get profit that way. But to one degree or another, most of these motivations are economic motivations, that they're very much coming down to these countries trying to expand their own wealth, and what they find and the methods that they use to accumulate wealth, while very unscrupulous, I would say, that's always their sort of main goal. A lot of people brought up the idea of religion as being a main factor, and I'm going to say you're not wrong in this, but I wouldn't say it's the primary factor. Of course, one of the reasons why Ferdinand and Isabella wanted to fund Columbus was to try to launch another crusade, which would have ended horribly because the Ottoman Empire was far stronger than Europe at this point in time. But regardless, that was their sort of motivation behind it. And certainly once they did establish sustained contact with the Americas, the religious aspect of it starts to gain, I would say, more importance than the very first wave of explorers who very much were devoted to trying to find things that they could profit off of. Once they did realize, though, there was this large population who were not Christians, the Catholic Church gets involved and starts trying to send more missionaries to try to convert them. And we'll see in the document exercise, while there is debate about how to treat the American Indians that they are engaging with. It seemed like, for the most part, and particularly when the Catholic Church, after the Reformation time period, the Counter-Reformation, a big portion of that was to try to expand the Catholic influence by converting those peoples in the Americas. So certainly I would say that's a portion of it, but for the very earliest explorers, maybe not the first element. A lot of people also brought up this idea of sort of personal glory that the explorers wanted. I'd certainly say that's an element, but probably once more not as much as a financial gain that they were hoping to achieve. But if they were able to get some notoriety in the meantime, I would say they would figure all the better. At this point in time, especially for these early explorers, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in accumulating land or control over populations. The only reason they really wanted to have control over the American Indians, for example, was to try to get them to look for gold for them, was to look for things that would directly profit them. So I would say sort of control and expansion of land and territory only in the sense of it trying to lead to more immediate profits. So this next question was very topical. Our country is currently engaged in a debate about how we should view and remember Christopher Columbus. In light of what we have learned this week, how do you view Columbus? Do you think he should still be celebrated as a national hero with his own holiday and commemorative statues, or do you think we should reconsider and possibly remove such monuments? I really love the thought that a lot of you put into this question. It seemed like you really tried to look at all the information that was presented in the PowerPoint and the textbook, as well as sort of your own experiences as far as how you have learned this information beforehand, what has changed, what you learned this week. Or maybe what you already knew, and just sort of what you've brought into this question. A lot of you thought that, sort of given that Christopher Columbus was not the first to discover America, that, essentially American Indians, of course, were the first to discover America, and he's not the first European to discover America. That, of course, was Leif Erikson. That is somewhat being misinterpreted or represented oftentimes of Christopher Columbus. The fact that he sort of just got lost and happened to stumble upon the Americas somewhat sort of pokes holes in this idea of him being sort of such a genius navigator. And a lot of people brought up the idea of the human rights abuses that occurred either directly by him or under his rule while he was the governor of those islands, which were detailed, but are some pretty horrific things. And particularly if you look at the a sharp decrease in decline in the American Indian population during that time, due partially to disease, but also to some pretty horrific genocide. Um, Certainly, those are all things that people brought up as far as why they believe that certainly Christopher Columbus deserves to be reconsidered in how we are taught and learn about him, and possibly how he is remembered as well. But also, a lot of people sought to sort of create a balance here, because certainly, while all those things are true, Columbus is still a historically significant figure. Though he wasn't the first to discover America, he was the first to essentially lead the expedition that established sustained contact, and that's sort of the key, right? Where a lot of the things that are going to be coming after this were only made possible by that sustained contact between European and the Americas. That the first expedition from Leif Erikson, that was never established. It was a small community that was abandoned fairly quickly. There was never a large go-between between the Americas and Eurasia. Certainly after Columbus's expedition, that does happen. Also, in order to launch this expedition, Christopher Columbus had to be fairly intelligent as far as how he went about funding it. And also he had to be fairly brave and have knowledge of seafaring to get as far as he did across the Atlantic Ocean. So people are really trying to find a way and think about how can we kind of create a balance between these two ideas, the historical significance versus the fact that maybe he certainly was not as great as a person as we've come to believe, and maybe did not accomplish all those things to the level that we were originally taught. And particularly when you start getting down to the idea of monuments and the celebration, the national holiday that we still have for him, a lot of people said that they would be okay with doing away with those, or certainly trying to recontextualize them in some way. There was a sense from a lot of people they don't want to erase history, and that somehow targeting monuments or Columbus Day would be just trying to erase history in general. Which is somewhat confusing to me because, I mean, monuments aren't history, and national holiday isn't history. Certainly, I don't think anyone's arguing that Columbus shouldn't be taught in the classroom. He shouldn't be taught in college classes like this. I don't think anyone's really saying that he should be forgotten. And I think it sort of brings up the point of the purpose of a lot of these monuments and the holiday. The purpose of these monuments when they were created, and the purpose for which they were created, wasn't information. It wasn't to inform people that, hey, this guy exists and these are the realistic things he did. The purpose was for glorification, to say that this is a great individual that we should aspire to be like. And I think that's where a lot of the criticism does warrant some idea of what we should do with these monuments and so forth. A lot of people brought up Howard Zinn's discussion on this and how he said, well, maybe you shouldn't take down the monuments, but there should be some way to at least use them to create a broader discussion. I had one person create the suggestion that maybe we should put up another statue next to the heroic looking one of him committing some sort of crime, or doing something not so glorious, which I don't know if that's necessarily the way to go, but certainly I think one of the problems that a lot of people have with the monuments is that they do only tell that one side of history, right? That it's not a complete holistic side, and trying to struggle to find a way to present that and not just having these monuments there as a glorification. One more item that was brought up by a lot of people is this idea that we shouldn't judge Christopher Columbus by our modern perspective, that he was a person of his time, that it could have been any number of people from Europe who came to the Americas and they would have behaved in a similar way because sort of the ethics of medieval Europe were different than our own modern times. And I think that's sort of a dangerous and slippery slope to go down, particularly because what you're doing is essentially confirming that the only viewpoint that matters is the viewpoint of Europeans. Because that viewpoint, as much as you want to say that, well, it was just part of Christopher Columbus's culture and society and how he was raised to look down on people of different religion and people who looked different than him, it certainly was not in the culture or the society of the Taino Indians to be tortured and mutilated and killed. They certainly would have been making a judgment about Christopher Columbus, and it would have been very different than the people in Europe would have been making. So when you say that we can't sort of judge him by a modern perspective, what you're really saying is you only want to judge him by one cultural perspective, the European cultural perspective in history, and not accounting for how he would have been viewed and interpreted by other cultures around the world, and particularly those who he would have been most impactful of. So just something to think about and consider. Alright, so what do you see as the most important and impactful aspects of the Columbian Exchange? First and foremost, there seemed like there was a little bit of confusion in a few people's answers here. The Columbian Exchange is not really referring to Christopher Columbus. It's not referring to Christopher Columbus sort of running around and exchanging a bunch of things or doing a bunch of trading. The name's coming from Columbus only insofar as he was once more sort of the first person to establish this sustained contact. And the Columbian Exchange really occurs over the first few hundred years following the establishment of this sustained contact as more and more people, animal, plants, diseases are exchanged and the consequences of them are starting to be felt. So one huge impact is an increase in population due to the exchange in these foods. As really there's a number of locations around the world, even at this time, that see population increases simply to having these foods available. For example, you see in Northern Europe the introduction of the potato having a huge impact on people being able to plant this very nutritious food in a very northern climate and being able to get higher population levels in locations like Ireland, Scandinavia, Scotland, and so forth than they would have been able to prior to this time. Also, you see the introduction of yams and corn in the Middle East and in China, also leading to large population increases in those locations. So it certainly has an immediate impact as far as crops being transplanted to new climates where they might grow even better than where they were originally being grown, and being able to used to sustain higher population levels. And of course, if you look at the modern world today, pretty much the population levels that we have are dependent upon the same crops to a certain degree being produced in massive quantities. If you look at, for example, how much wheat is grown and produced in the United States, of course, wheat is a product that came from Eurasia, was not native to the Americas. Now, the vast majority of the world's wheat is being grown right here in North America, and that's just one way that sort of the world's current populations are being sustained by these foods, as well as a number of others that we've already talked about, potatoes and so forth, are still having an impact. Also, just thinking about the food that we eat and that we love today, most of them, or not all of them, but quite a few of them are made possible by this. If you think about hamburgers, for example, you have the introduction of the wheat for the bun and the burgers with the ketchup coming from tomatoes, a food from the New World. Of course, the cows were from Eurasia. Think about spaghetti once more, combining tomatoes with wheat or something to make the pasta. Chocolate, it would not be around without the Columbian Exchange, sort of introducing sugar to the cocoa beans from South America. Spanish rice, pretty much all of Mexican food cuisine is based upon this. Pizza. We would not have pizza without the Columbian Exchange. Pretty much, if you want to think of any of the foods that you love to eat, a lot of them are influenced by the Columbian Exchange to some degree. And of course, the Columbian Exchange, while it did have this sort of overall impact that was more or less positive as far as leading to larger global population levels, there's certainly a dark side to the exchange as well, and that is particularly the place that was not well served by the Columbian Exchange were the people who were already living in the Americas, the American Indian populations, as they, because they had been essentially separated and had not lived in close contact with large land animals like the Europeans had for centuries, that the Europeans had essentially been in kind of a biological arms race with these various sicknesses that had originally been transferred pretty much from large animals into human populations, then from human to human. And of course, as we know, viruses throughout time, they change, they evolve, they get more deadly as people's immune systems become stronger. So this arms race had been going on for thousands of years in Eurasia and had not been going on in the Americas. So when these diseases were influenced to the Americas, they were like super virulent forms and strands of them, and certainly had a devastating effect. Of course, population loss could be anywhere 80-90% of the total population, and all of this wouldn't have been necessarily from the diseases themselves, but just sort of from the diseases and the ramifications that come with it. If you think of 90% of people in the population dying, that's going to incredibly cut down on the amount of food that can be created, and that's just going to lead to a larger loss of life. Even if it's just 50% of the people dying from the disease, you could see 20, 30 more being, dying from lack of food, political chaos, and so forth. There are going to be sort of ramifications from these diseases being so deadly. and I think that that's something to very much take into account. That a lot of our perception that we have of the American Indian, their civilizations and populations, come from accounts that were created after this time period, that were created after these diseases had already gone through. So, for example, when the colonists from Great Britain start interacting with American Indian groups in North America, they're interacting with groups that had already lost a very large percentage of their population and were really most of the times new political organizations that were made up of the survivors and weren't nearly as large or as strong as what had existed before this time period. And that's why if you want to look at everything that happens after this time period as far as the expansion of Europeans or Eurasians into the Americas, it's really all predicated on these diseases having such a devastating effect. There's no way that the colonization of the Americas would have been as successful or even successful at all had these diseases not had such a huge impact. A really good case study for this is the coast of Africa. The Europeans didn't have large colonizing efforts in Africa until after the industrialization time period and the introduction of quinine to combat malaria. And it's not that they didn't want to have large colonies in Africa at this point in time. I'm sure they would have, but there were strong kingdoms, lots and lots of people already living there who were going to fight them off and just not let them come in and do what they wanted. And that same situation probably would have played out in the Americas too, had there been 90% more individuals there. So certainly from this time period going on in the class, it's always something to keep in mind that the only thing that made them possible are these sort of devastating effects that the Columbian Exchange diseases ended up having. Of course, a lot of people mention slavery as well, that's going to be an effect of this transfer of people from one location to another, either willingly in the form of colonization or unwillingly in the form of slave labor, and how much slave labor is used to boost the economies of the European colonies once they are established. We're going to be covering that in more detail next week. But I think looking at the Columbian Exchange is a very good example of really how you need to take a nuanced approach and look at a lot of the items and events that happen in history. How it's not necessarily either a good thing or a bad thing, that they can have very long and far-reaching consequences that might be very good for some people and might be very bad for others. So I think it's a tricky slope to try to characterize things in history as thing good or thing bad. Most times the answer is going to be thing complex, and that certainly the Columbian Exchange is a very good example of that. All right, moving on to our document exercise then. Looking at question number 1 here, how does Bartolomeo de las Casas depict American Indians? And what evidence does he present to argue his case about whether or not they should be considered civilized? I thought the class did a great job of bringing in direct quotes to help answer this question. That pretty early on in the document, de las Casas really lays out that the American Indians that he was interacting with had established laws, economies, trade, city, culture, pretty much all the hallmarks that he would consider civilization. And almost he's saying if you want to create a checklist of what civilization is, the American Indians are going to check off all of those boxes. I think he even goes so far at one point in time as to say that the American Indians are in some ways superior to Europe, which certainly was not a message that was getting back from a lot of the recording and interpretations that were being heard in Europe. He's certainly making a strong argument early on here that American Indians should certainly be considered civilized, and that's going to try to sort of invalidate using that old sort of Aristotle logic of people who are uncivilized being legitimate to enslave them. Going on to question number 2, in what ways does Bartolomeo de las Casas use European and Spanish history to make his argument? In this factor, he really starts using an example from Spanish history of when the peninsula of Spain was invaded by the Roman Empire to try to make his point, where essentially the Romans came in, conquered the Spanish peninsula in a similar way that he felt the Spanish were invading the land of the American Indians. So he certainly starts off by saying that, well, some of the American Indians are fighting back. Well, the Spanish were fighting back against the Romans. That's something that's still sort of glorified in Spanish history. So if the Spanish had the right to fight back against the Romans, why don't American Indians have the right to fight back against the Spanish? He also uses this idea that the Romans sort of viewed the Spanish in the same way that the Spanish are currently viewing American Indians. Sort of saying, at one point in time, we were sort of seen very similar to the American Indians. And then goes on to sort of make the point that if the Romans had treated the Spanish in the same way that they were treating the American Indians, where would Spanish civilization be today? Sort of with the implication that Spain would be much weaker and certainly would look nothing like it does today if the Romans had been sort of as tyrannical to the Spanish as the Spanish were currently being to the American Indians. So sort of a sneaky way to use sort of a point that was well known in Spanish history to argue for why what the Spanish were doing wasn't necessarily the correct path. Going on to question number 3, in what ways does Bartolomeo de las Casas' European bias show in this article, and what parts of his argument might have American Indians refuted? And a lot of people did a very good job picking up on this, that you can certainly see Bartolomeo de las Casas' bias when he starts talking about religion, right? I mean, he is a Catholic bishop himself. That's one of the sort of the main reasons why he is there. So while he's willing to sort of grant the American Indians laws and economies and cities and a large swath of things that he thinks are sort of pretty much on par or very recognizable in Europe and have value and merit, the one thing that he sort of is always coming back to is this idea that, well, they can be converted or they should be converted. Sort of saying and assuming that his religion of Christianity is in some way, shape, or form superior, and that is just, he doesn't even seem to give it much thought, like just sort of a bygone conclusion that, well, maybe we shouldn't be necessarily conquering them, but we should certainly still be converting them, and certainly that's going to be an opinion that a lot of the American Indians probably and certainly will, after this time period, be refuting, saying that their religious ideas are just as valid as those coming from Europe. So there's no good reason, if there's not a sword pointed at them and they're not being forced, to completely give up their worldview and their belief systems. He also seems very, I would say, resigned to the idea that there's going to be some sort of dominion by Spain. He's sort of not arguing that Spain shouldn't be there, that they shouldn't be conquering. He's more or less saying we shouldn't be enslaving them, that we can rule over them, but maybe we should be doing it in a less harmful manner. But he certainly is not saying that Spain doesn't deserve to be there at all and should sort of pull back and just give the land back to the American Indians, which of course a lot of the American Indians probably would have very much refuted as well, saying, no, this is our land, we've been here for centuries, get the hell out. Looking at question number 4, what impact do you think this document had on the debate described in the opening paragraph? In the end, do you think more Spanish would be likely the side of Bartolomeo de las Casas or Juan Inés Sepúlveda? For the most part, people sort of thought that Sepúlveda, despite the great points that de las Casas made, Sepúlveda's side would still probably be the one that would come out on top, particularly because sort of as history shows that was more of the trend moving forward, and also because the Spanish would have seen it in their best interest to keep viewing the American Indians as a population to be conquered and enslaved. But it's not quite as simple of a story as that, although that point of view certainly does have merit, because there were some people back in Europe that de las Casas and other people who are reporting on the ill treatment of American Indians were receiving. One of those was Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who very shortly after this time period is going to be essentially controlling all of Spain through dynastic marriages and so forth. He's going to be controlling the Holy Roman Empire and a number of other locations within Europe, including Spain. And he actually sends out an order telling the conquistadors and the people running these encomiendas that they are no longer allowed to enslave American Indians. But this comes into sort of one of the problems that you occur to here with the what's going on in the Americas, and that's the fact that there was really no direct political control that King Charles had. And while he could issue this, there was nothing that was going to be making the Spanish in the Americas, who were profiting off of the enslavement of American Indians, there was nothing that was going to compel them to actually follow this rule or this order. So for the most part, a lot of them just ignored it. When you really start seeing some movement on this is when the Spanish start encountering more pushback. For example, the Pueblo War, where certainly their kind of just bullying tactics blow up on them and ends up becoming much more costly. They realize that, hey, maybe if we're not so heavy-handed, we'll actually sort of get more profit out of our interactions than if we try to just come in as conquerors. And also, once there starts being more direct control by the Spanish government over these colonies and over these locations, you start seeing a change and shift in how the American Indian populations are going to be organized and treated and so forth. So once there is more of a say from Europe, you do start seeing a shift and a change. And it's hard to tell exactly how much arguments such as De Las Casas is factored into that. But I would say it certainly probably wasn't completely overlooked or ignored, as it seemed to did have an impact on some, at least within Europe.